Well, good morning. Good to see you. We started a series together last week called It's Not a Trick Question. It was on the screen, the prodigal. And we said last week, the heart of this series is, yes, it's about a prodigal son, but it's about a lot more than that. And so last week we talked about the prodigal son. This week we're talking about the prodigal father. And what I love about this series, and what I love about that word prodigal, if you've heard that word before, I think for most of us, even if you're not a Christian, you've heard that word somewhere along the way. The word prodigal, it just means extravagant. And we tell the story as if it's about a prodigal son, because it is, in a way, a story about a son who goes away and lives an extravagant, wild lifestyle in a distant country. We talked about that last week, and what I'm excited about together this morning is it's really a story about a prodigal father who is extravagant, wasteful even to an extent, and the grace that he's going to extend towards the son. And I'm excited about next week because next week is about the older brother. And if you know anybody who's a judgmental Christian, make sure you bring them to church next week, okay? It's your turn to drag them to church, okay? In fact, if you get invited to church next week, that's kind of bad for you. But next week's about the older brother, and I'm excited about that. But today's about the prodigal father, this extravagant father who extends grace towards his broken and his hurting son. And this concept of grace is somewhat mysterious, but what I love about it is that every single one of us in this room, we all ultimately crave grace, whether you're a Christian or not. We all want grace, especially in moments of crisis or moments of peril or moments where we find ourselves in a desperate situation. In fact, if you leave church today and you get pulled over for speeding down the 15, what's the first thing you're going to ask for today? Yeah, whether you're a Christian or not, you're asking for grace in that moment. We all want grace. If you're 5 minutes late for your flight and the ticketing agent is closing the boarding door, what's the first thing you're going to ask for? It's grace. Yeah, we all crave grace at the deepest levels of our soul. We're going to see this more next week. Grace is the first thing we want, but it's often the last thing we will extend in the direction of someone who's hurt us and caused us pain. For that person, we want justice often. That's what we crave. But grace is what we all want, and it's ultimately what the Father gives to the prodigal son, and it's always what God gives to you and to me in our lives, and that's what we celebrate as followers of Christ, and that's what we hope everybody ultimately receives in their life. If you have a Bible, you can turn with me to Leviticus chapter 6 this morning. If you don't have a Bible, you can follow along on the screens, or you can download the CRB app. That's a great place to follow along as well. Leviticus chapter 6, this is all the way back a few thousand years before Jesus even tells the story of the prodigal son. And the reason I want us to look at this is in the Old Testament, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus chapter 6. The reason I want us to see this is because it sets some context for the story of the prodigal son. We said last week that Jesus tells this story on a hot afternoon in Israel, and there's a contentious crowd that's gathered when Jesus tells the story. There's a group of people that are the sinners. They're the tax collectors, which we said last week, they're criminals, they're thieves. They essentially have extorted money from the impoverished, from the poor. And then there's the religious people, the Pharisees, and we often talk about them as if they're cartoonish, There's sort of this goofy group of people who just wants to enforce all the rules. But 2,000 years ago, I probably would have been a Pharisee. You might have been a Pharisee, because the Pharisees, especially on this day, they're angry at the tax collectors because they violated the law. And they've extorted money, and they want them to pay it back, because you go all the way back to the book of Leviticus. The Old Testament, in particular, the first 5 books of it, function as the Bible, and they often function as the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence for the nation of Israel. It's a social, moral framework for the nation of Israel at the time of Jesus. And so on this particular afternoon, when Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son, you have the law breakers and you have the law keepers gathered to hear. And the law keepers, the Pharisees, are angry because the tax collectors have violated this particular code of law. Leviticus chapter 6, starting in verse 2 together. If anyone sins and is unfaithful to the Lord by deceiving a neighbor about something entrusted to them or left in their care, or about something stolen, or if they cheat their neighbor, or if they find lost property and lie about it, or if they swear falsely about any such sin that people may commit. When they sin in any of these ways and realize their guilt, they must return what they have stolen or taken by extortion. The tax collectors would be guilty of this. Or what was entrusted to them, or the lost property that they found. And whatever it is, or whatever it was that they swore falsely about, they must make restitution in full and add a fifth of the value to it. In other words, they have to pay it back with interest, essentially. A fifth of the value to it and give it all to the owner on the day that they present their guilt offering. The law was very clear. So when Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son, you remember this from last week, the Pharisees, the religious people, they're angry because Jesus is the concept or the idea was table fellowship. He's having meals with sinners. And that was more than just sort of chips and salsa. That was a way to dignify people who did not deserve it, because the law was very clear. For the tax collectors, for the people that were in the crowd that day, in order to reconcile to God, they needed to repay for what they'd done. The law was very clear. Reconciliation, if there was going to be a meal share between the Pharisees and the tax collectors, the tax collectors needed to repay for what they'd done, the money that they'd taken. I'm not so sure I disagree with them. I mean, that just sounds fair. And on this particular afternoon, the reason the Pharisees are angry at Jesus is because they're essentially saying, you do not take sin serious. Because if you did, you would enforce the law that says reconciliation means repayment. Restitution, you got to repay if you want to reconcile. And Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son as a way, everybody in the crowd would know that particular rule. And Jesus tells the story of the prodigal son as a way to say, hey, I do take sin serious. I just don't think that's the best way to handle it. I don't think that's the best cure for the problem. If you have a Bible, Luke chapter 15, you can turn with me. This is the story of the prodigal son, or you can follow along on the screens as well. Starting in verse 13, this is the story of the prodigal son and father. Not long after that, the younger son, this is the boy we looked at last week, got together all he had and set off for a distant country. I don't know how that worked. I don't know if he went to the mailbox one day. There was a brochure in the mail, said all-inclusive vacation. You need to go, special rate being offered. But he takes the bait and he goes for it. And we said last week, Jesus is a brilliant storyteller. He's layering the story with it keeps getting worse for this kid. He goes to live with the Gentiles, which he would never do. There he squandered his wealth in wild living. And after he spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. And he began to be in need. Verse 15, so he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his field to feed the pigs. And so he hasn't just gone to live with Gentiles, now he's gone to work for a Gentile, and now he's unclean because he's working with unclean animals. So there's a religious implication. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave this kid anything. When he came to his senses, and we said last week, that was a powerful moment. He comes to his senses. How many of my father's hired servants back home have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? And so he wakes up in the pig pen, and he's like, how in the world did I get here? I got suckered into this. How in the world did I end up in this situation? And he comes to his senses. How many of us, you've ever taken a vacation somewhere and the vacation just didn't go the way you thought it was gonna go? Anybody ever been in that situation? Everybody with kids, raise your hand. It's all what Roseanne and I always say. When we take kids somewhere, it's an away game, man. It's always an away game. Several years ago, when Roseanne and I got married or got engaged, we made a deal that she would plan the wedding and I would plan the honeymoon. I thought that was a pretty good deal. And she's a wedding photographer, and she knows, all about floral arrangements and, catering and all the sort of things that go with weddings. And I knew nothing about planning a wedding. And so I said, well, you take care of the wedding, and I'll plan the honeymoon. And I thought that was a pretty good deal. And so I began to put some feelers out with travel agents, just trying to, kind of figure out what was. I had not been on a vacation since I was 12, and I did not plan that one. So I didn't know what to do to, kind of figure out where to go. And so I start putting some travel agent feelers out there, and I start getting some of the brochures back in the mail. And so these things start coming in the mail, these brochures for vacations. You've seen these before. This one's from Costco, actually. You can vacation at Costco. I don't know if you knew that. There's a mattress section and sneak out at night, steal samples. I've done it. It's great. You start looking at the brochure, and I'm looking at the brochure that the first travel agent sent, and it's a picture of a catamaran. It's a picture of just beautiful beaches as far as the eye could see. And there's a room at this one particular resort in particular that has an open air concept room, which is essentially a room with 3 walls. And I saw that and I thought, that's the most romantic thing ever. What could possibly go wrong with an open air concept room? That's brilliant. And so I clicked book it on the first one that they sent. I thought, that's going to be fantastic. She's going to love the honeymoon. And so it's St. Lucia is where I booked the trip. And wedding comes and goes without a hitch. And surprise her on the way to the airport. Hey, we're going to St. Lucia. And I kind of told her what to pack. And we get to the resort, which I had seen on the brochure. And I walk in the lobby. On the brochure, the lobby had like a 7-tiered fountain in it. In reality, you walked in the lobby, it was like 7 stray cats walking around. It was immediately like this sense of the photo's been cropped a little bit. And so I'm trying not to say anything, and I'm kind of looking at the brochure, and I asked the guy, well, where's our room? He said, well, your room's up on that mountain, and we'll take you to it. And so we go to the room, and I'm thinking, when she sees the open-air concept room, that's when she's going to realize she married the man of her dreams in that moment. And so we walk into the open-air concept room. It turns out a lot can go wrong with an open-air concept room. There's something called a mosquito, and within about 5 minutes, my new bride has about 30 bug bites on her. And I realized we are not going to smell like perfume and cologne on our honeymoon. We're going to smell like off and bug spray for these 7 days. And so, we're sitting in the room, doing this thing the whole time. And I'm like, I've seen pictures of the beach. The beach is going to save the whole thing. And so we're going to go to the beach. And so we go down to the beach. And I'm looking at it. And I got the brochure. But then in the brochure, it looked like the Caribbean. But when you walked out to this beach, it looked like Lake Hodges or something. It just looked like, and not the pretty Escondido side. I'm talking about the RB side where it's like trees popping up and you're walking over the bridge. Like, I'm not even so sure we need this bridge, man. It's that kind of a vibe. And there's you cannot make this up. There are farm animals on the beach, and it's a tiny little parcel of land. I'm not kidding. It was like laying out in the middle of a petting zoo. It was weird. Like a chicken pecking at your toe the whole time. I'm like, forget about this, man. Let's just go back up to the room. And so she's trying not to say anything. She doesn't want me to feel bad. And I don't know what to say. And so the first night, go to dinner. The next morning, we wake up. We're 1 day into the honeymoon. And she looks at me that first morning. She's like, I don't feel so well. And I'm telling you, the sicknesses of all sicknesses set in for Rosanna, and she could not keep any food down for 5 days, just sick as she could be. And so I'm sitting there in that moment, and I'm like, when I thought about planning a honeymoon, this is not what I had in mind. And then I'm thinking, what could possibly go wrong? We're going to save this thing. It's all going to turn around. It is not supposed to rain in St. Lucia in the month of May. They told me that. And all of a sudden, the rainstorm of all rainstorms sets in for 7 straight days. It does not stop raining. And this is when the open-air concept room is really stupid. Because all of a sudden in our room, it is just whoosh, and every creature on God's green earth is now seeking refuge in our room. And you see birds flying around. I saw a chicken I saw on the beach the day before, kind of walking around our kitchen, and it was like honeymooning in the middle of Noah's Ark, man. It was awesome. And poor Rosanna throwing up in the other room. This was our honeymoon story. And there was one TV in the room, and it had one station that played Aaron Brockovich, the movie, in French without subtitles. And my honeymoon, I just laid on the couch watching Aaron Brockovich in French on repeat for 4 straight days. I don't speak French, by the way. Still have not seen Aaron Brockovich in English. But that's our honeymoon story. The photo was cropped. You got there and you thought, that's not what I signed up for. And Jesus is telling the story of the prodigal son who ends up in the pig pen to say, that's exactly what sin is like. I do take sin serious, Pharisees. And that's what sin is like. And many of us in this room, you could stand up and tell the story. That's your story of life, where all of a sudden you had a plan, you had a getaway, an escape. Maybe nobody even knew about it, but you got a brochure in your head and heart that said, if you could just do that, if you could just go there, if you could just have your cake and eat it too, if you could just get with her. And you didn't want your mom to know, you didn't want your wife to know, you didn't want your kids to know, you didn't even really want God to know. You just wanted to get to that thing. And you got there, and yeah, there was a season of wild living, But there was a moment where you woke up and you said, the photo was cropped. This is not what I came for. This isn't what I thought it was going to be. And Jesus is saying, I do take sin serious, and that's just the path that sin takes in our life. And we don't use that word. We're not like, oh, I'm going to go sin today. We don't think of it in those terms. But we find ourselves in life. The brochure comes, the invitation comes. The way that James says it in James chapter 1 is that temptation comes, and temptation leads to sin. And sin, when it is full grown or accomplished, it gives birth to death. And it's not a physical death. It doesn't have to be. It could be death to some part of you. It could be an emotional death. It could be the death of a relationship. It could be a spiritual death where some part of you that used to be alive on the inside is cold and it's fizzled out. But it leads to a death of some kind. And that's just the path that sin takes. It's temptation. The brochure comes, a moment in the distant country where you're like in the wild living, and then the moment where you come to your senses and go, wait a second, the photo was cropped. Something's died on the inside in this process. It's always a death to your freedom every single time, isn't it? Many of us in this room, you could stand up and tell the story with the addiction, with the pattern, with the way of life that you thought was going to set you free. And you made that decision in your freedom under your own volition. And in the process of doing something, pursuing freedom, you ended up losing your freedom in the process. Because freedom is never found away from God. It's found with God every single time. And freedom for this kid, the prodigal, was not found away from the arms of the Father. It's found in the arms of the Father. That's where freedom's found in life for you and for me. As free as you will ever be in this life is with God, not away from God. In the arms of God, at home with God. And many of us, you could stand up and tell the story of the photo being cropped. Going, how did I get here? And when this kid realizes where he is, he has a plan. I've got to go home and I got to make this right. And the problem isn't that he's broken a rule. The problem is something else. And Jesus is going to put his finger on the problem, and it's going to shock the Pharisees. But this kid hasn't quite figured it out. Verse 18, it says, the kid goes home and says, I will set out. Remember last week, he gave a speech, a rehearsed speech. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. And so this kid's plan is, I will go home and I'm going to work off the money that I've taken. I'm going to repay the dad. That's his plan. And we often read the story and we think, well, that's the turning point of the story when he realizes he comes to his senses. But it's not the turning point of the story. In his mind, because he lives in a world where reconciliation is repayment, I need to go back and I need to fix it. I need to repay what I've taken, what I've stolen. And the Pharisees at this moment, as Jesus is telling the story, they would be coming to high-five Jesus. That's exactly right. Reconciliation is repayment. But the problem this kid has is not a broken rule. It's a broken relationship with a father. And ultimately, the human problem, our problem, what got us to the distant country, what led to the regretful choice, it wasn't that we violated some rules. It wasn't that we broke some code of conduct, religious or otherwise. The problem ultimately for all of us comes down to a broken relationship with the Father. And Jesus puts his finger on it and says, the problem's not a broken rule. It's not the money that he took. The problem is the broken relationship with the Father. And this kid thinks he can just go home and pay it off, and that's not how the Father works. And the Father is going to extend grace. But I think there's something in all of us when we come to our senses. I know it's true for me in moments that I've woken up and realized that I have caused harm to somebody else or myself. There is something in me, just like there's something in you that says, I need to fix it. I've broken a rule. I've violated trust. I've done something. I need to go back and fix it. I need to make it right. And you'll even have people come to you and say, well, you know, when you realize you've messed up, you need to meet God halfway. You need to do something. But Jesus is telling the story to say there's really nothing you can do to fix it. And halfway is too far for you to go. And all you can do is throw yourself upon the mercy of the Father in that moment. Halfway is too far for you to go. You cannot fix yourself. You need the mercy and the tenderness and the grace of the Father, and that's what's going to be extended towards the son. You keep going in the story. I love this scene, one of the most powerful scenes in the entire Bible. Let's look at it together. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. And he ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. And the son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." Notice the son there, he doesn't repeat the line about repaying the father. He knows in this moment all he can do is just receive the grace and the mercy the father's giving him, that he does not deserve. It says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, was filled with compassion for him, runs to the son. And we said last week, the story takes place at the edge of a village. And the village people, when they saw the kid walking back through the city gate, they would immediately run out to perform a kazeza. If you remember this from last week, there's a ceremony that was called a kazeza. It was a shame ceremony. And we talked about our shame ceremonies last week where it was a weird thing to do, but in the first century, and the audience of the Pharisees and the tax collectors would certainly know this, that you would take a jar and you would fill it with corn and nuts, and you would break it over someone that you wanted to cut off from the village. And kazeza just means to cut off, literally, because someone had shamed the village, they had shamed themselves, they married somebody they shouldn't. You would perform a kazeza, you would break this over them as a way to ceremonially, in a ceremony, say, you are no longer a part of us. And so when the villagers see the kid coming down the driveway and the kid's walking through the city gate looking like the distant country, they'd start grabbing the jar, start grabbing the corn, start grabbing the nuts, and they would want to run out to perform the kazeza. Everybody that was in the audience that day would expect that's the ending of the story. And Jesus says something else happens. The father sees the son, runs to the son, throws himself over the son, kisses the son. And the word kisses there means repeated kisses. He kisses the son and he covers the son in that moment. And essentially, the powerful scene of this is that the father says, there's not going to be a kazeza today. And he covers the son. And we miss this in our context, but in the first century world, a man would never run. In fact, men of honor would walk upright with a stiff upper back. That was a way to say, I'm a man to be revered. You would live your whole life in this village. You would never see a man run. It was considered a dishonor. In fact, Aristotle even has a quote, men of honor, they do not run. You would live your whole life and you would have never seen what you saw on this particular day. Because to run, a man would have to hike up his robe and expose his ankles, which you would never do. It would be humiliating to run. But the father is willing to run to the son, throw himself over the son as a way to say, no one's humiliating my son. And the father is allowing himself to be humiliated so that his son won't be. And the power of this story is Jesus is saying that's what God is like. And the Pharisees would be walking out that day saying, you can't prove that that's what God is like. That's not what God is like. There's a rule, there's a law. And Jesus is telling this story to say God cares a lot more about lawbreakers than he cares about law. And he cares a lot more about those that the shame ceremony is going to be performed over, and he's going to cover them when everyone else wants to humiliate them. And Jesus tells this story knowing that he is going to go to a cross in a few months. And at the cross, the story of the prodigal son gets flesh and blood. Because it's at the cross where Jesus, God, the Father, humiliates himself to cover your humiliation and to cover your shame. And the power of the story of the prodigal son is that Jesus knows that he is going to go to a cross and enact the story of the prodigal son, and that God will allow himself to be humiliated on your behalf so that nobody could shame or humiliate you for the wrong that you've done in life. And I don't know where that lands on you this morning. I don't know if you're in life going, well, I'm on plan C, I'm on plan D. Some of the bad things that have happened to me, I probably deserve. God's probably teaching me a lesson. I probably deserve to not see them anymore. I probably deserve to be cut off from that group of people because of things that I've done. And the story of the prodigal son says there's no shame ceremonies in the presence of Jesus. And God has in fact gone beyond that, and he has covered your humiliation. He has covered your shame and humiliated himself so that you don't have to be. And the power of the story, the teeth of the story is that there are no plan Bs, plan Cs, and the economy of God. And you're fully restored, fully made a son, fully made a daughter, regardless of anything you've ever done in your life. It's not a story about an extravagant, wild son. It's a story about extravagant and wild grace that's given freely from the Father. It gets better than that. I love this story. It says he keeps going. The father's not done. It says the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. All of this is a way to say he is reinstated. He doesn't get the lesser robe. He doesn't get the servant's robe. He gets the full robe of the son. There's no plan B. There's no plan C in the economy of God. You are 100% the moment you step into the presence of Jesus. You are given a new name. You're given the full identity, the full sonship, the full daughtership of a child of God. And he says, you get the ring. You're part of this family. All this is symbolic. Sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. A fatted calf would feed about 100 people, which I love. That means that some of the people in the village who had a few moments earlier been wanting to perform the kazeza are now being fed at the ceremony to welcome this kid home. I love that. Be some awkward conversations at that party. Let's have a feast and celebrate. The father declares, for this son of mine was dead, and now he's alive again. He was lost, and now he's found. And so the music is playing, and they began to celebrate. And Jesus tells the story to some of the Pharisees that are probably left. Imagine most of them had walked out, and I imagine on that particular afternoon there were tax collectors, prostitutes that were weeping because Jesus was saying in that moment, that is how God treats sinners. That is how God treats people like you and people like me. And the power of this story, essentially, you could boil it down to this, is that in the economy of God, reconciliation happens before rehabilitation. Reconciliation happens before rehabilitation. That's the power of the story. Reconciliation happens before rehabilitation. And on the surface, that sounds like bad parenting. That sounds like, well, it shouldn't work that way. That's not what you should do. If you had a daughter or a son who had been on the streets or been away for several years and they had been hooked on drugs and they came home and you called me the night they came home and said, hey, Hannah's back, Justin's back, we're having a party. There'd be something in me and there'd be something in you that would say, well, wait a minute, have they been to rehab? Have they been cleaned up? And Jesus is telling the story, he said, that's not what God is like. The nature of God is that he celebrates reconciliation before people get cleaned up because he died for lawbreakers, not for law. And what makes Christianity different than every other religion, what makes Christianity so beautiful, so unique, is that every other religion puts at the center of the human problem and the human dilemma a broken rule. That human beings have violated some divine command, that there is a broken rule that we need to obey. That sits at the center of the human problem for every major religion. And Christianity says the ultimate problem is not a broken rule, it's a broken relationship between God and sinners. And when that gets reconciled, the heavens go wild and the heavens celebrate. Before we get cleaned up, God celebrates the prodigals, the sinners, lawbreakers like you and me. He did not die on a cross to enforce a law. He died on a cross to welcome lawbreakers. Reconciliation before rehabilitation. If we forget this as a church, you know what would begin to happen? If we began to forget this as Christians, as the body of Christ in this city, what would begin to happen is we would begin to treat rules as primary and people as secondary. We would begin to treat rules as primary, as the most important thing, and people as secondary to the rules. Some of us in here, the reason you're skeptical of Christians or the reason you're skeptical of church is because you've been around Christians that way, that treat rules as primary and people as secondary. Some of us, you grew up in a religious environment that was like that, where you went to church and the message you heard every single weekend when you were growing up was fix yourself, fix yourself, fix yourself, fix yourself. Let's all stand and sing Amazing Grace. I mean, it was weird. And there was something in there that you just thought, well, what's the point? Does God love me for who I am? And the power of the prodigal son story is that God flips the equation that we often get wrong, that he celebrates people more than he celebrates rules. He celebrates lawbreakers before he celebrates law being obeyed. He celebrates reconciliation before rehabilitation. If we get this wrong, if we begin to get this, messed up in our theology or in our head and in our heart, what begins to happen is over time, and nobody means for this to happen, but we begin to treat people terribly, thinking we're justified in doing it. Some of us, you've had Christians that have treated you terrible before because of things that you've said or things that you've done. In fact, if you ever want to treat somebody really poorly or really in a terrible way and feel okay about it, just convince yourself you did it for a spiritual reason. People do it all the time. And Jesus flips this equation at the cross and with the prodigal story and says, people are primary, rules are secondary. If we forget this, you know what begins to happen? For some of us, you know what would begin to happen, especially if you're new to church or you're coming back to church for the first time in a long time? You'll begin to look around at other Christians and you'll begin to think, if I could get my marriage to look like their marriage, if I could get my attitude to look like their attitude, if I could get my kids to act like their kids, and you'll begin to compare yourself to other Christians and think, until you get everything sort of figured out and fixed in your life, then you can begin to be reconciled to God. Then you can become like a full citizen of the kingdom of God. That's not how this grace thing works. And you're one prayer away from being reconciled to God. You're always one prayer away from being reconciled to the creator of all things. And when you pray that prayer and you invite Christ, you say, God, I want to be reconciled to you. I'm a lawbreaker. Then you begin to join the rehabilitation party with the rest of us. I mean, that's essentially what church is, isn't it? It's just rehab for sinners. Trying to recover from choices and decisions we made in the distant country. And rehab happens slowly. You know why rehab is slow? Because when you become a Christian, God will grant you amnesty, but he does not grant you amnesia, does he? And you still remember the distant country. You still remember the honeymoon. You still remember the smells of the pig pen. And it pulls and it tugs you back at times into a former way. And you have to remind yourself all the time, that's not who I am. I've been called a child of God, given the robe, the ring, a full new identity in the presence of Jesus. Jesus died for lawbreakers, not for law. People are primary and rules are secondary. And that's the power of this story. And that's the invitation for anybody who wants to come to Jesus. Let's pray together this morning. We're going to celebrate that in a few moments in song, but let's pray together. This morning, I just wonder if somebody within the sound of my voice just wants to be reconciled to God. And we're not going to make you walk an aisle. We're not going to make you stand up, but maybe for the first time in your life, you realize in the heart of the Father is turned towards a lawbreaker. Towards people who've sinned, people who've messed up. And that's you. And maybe for the first time in your life, you're saying, I want to be reconciled to God. If that's anybody, you just raise your hand and say, that's me. I want to be reconciled to the Father. Anybody for the first time in your life this morning? I want to be reconciled to God. There's a broken relationship between me and my Creator. That's beautiful. It's beautiful. Jesus, I thank you this morning for those that are raising their hand, those that are like me that need that reminder. Every single day of my life, at least, I need that reminder. There's no shame ceremonies in your presence. There's no declarations of guilt in your presence. There's no reminder of the law. There's just grace extended to lawbreakers. And God, yeah, you celebrate when people get cleaned up. You celebrate when people begin to put their lives back together. You celebrate when people begin to live the way you created them to live. But you're the Father who celebrates not rules being obeyed, but relationships being restored between God and sinners. Make us that kind of a church. Never let us forget that. People are primary. Rules are secondary. And we thank you for that. It's in the powerful name of Jesus we say.